Hi, I'm Susan Speak Up. I want to welcome everyone tonight to this webinar to learn about Pennsylvania's school funding lawsuit. I'm the Executive Director of Education Voters of Pennsylvania. We are a statewide advocacy and policy organization that is working to build a movement in the Commonwealth to achieve adequate and equitable funding for public education so that all students have an opportunity to learn. So I'd just like to do a little housekeeping before we get started. We will be recording this, just so that you know that. We would like everyone to please stay muted until the end of the presentation. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat. We'll keep track of those, and then we will ask them when the presentation's over. We do have a hard stop at 8 o'clock, so if we get through the questions in the chat and we still have time, then we will open up to people asking questions. You can just raise your hand and then unmute and ask your question. So I think that is all that we have right now, and we are really fortunate to have with us Christina Moon from the Education Law Center and Dan Jurovic-Acklesberg from the Public Interest Law Center as our presenters tonight. And so I am going to turn this over to them right now, and they will do their presentation. And again, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and we will work on answering them when the presentation is over. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. My name is Christina Moon. I'm a staff attorney at the Education Law Center. I work out of the Philadelphia office in better times. Right now I'm coming to you from my home office, as most of you may be as well. My co-counsel, Dan, and I are gonna walk through some information about the lawsuit and about the system of public education funding in the state of Pennsylvania. I think we have a variety of folks here with a variety of prior knowledge, some very extensive. So stay with us, and hopefully there's something of interest for everybody along the spectrum. So briefly, just a little about us, if you're not familiar. Education Law Center, we are a nonprofit legal services organization, and in addition to this statewide school funding lawsuit, we also have a helpline. Parents and students across the state of Pennsylvania can call with particular individual questions, and we do some individual representation in addition to impact litigation and policy advocacy on wide-ranging issues. Dan, do you want to share a little bit about Public Interest Law Center?
Sure. So we're also a nonprofit legal organization based in the city of Philadelphia. We do impact litigation in a number of subject areas: housing, voting, the environment, employment, and of course, education. We're just happy to be here, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks. Okay, so Pennsylvania has significant financial inequities in its system of school funding, with one of the largest gaps of any state in the country in per child spending between the Commonwealth's poorest and wealthiest districts. Who might you imagine said something like this? The Education Law Center, the Public Interest Law Center. This acknowledgement of the Commonwealth's most significant reading achievement gaps between low-income students and students of color and their white, more affluent peers. Significant gaps evident with respect to high school graduation rates across the Commonwealth. 9 in 10 white students graduated high school in 4 years, compared with only 7 in 10 African-American and Latino students. Who said this? The Child Advocacy Group, perhaps? In fact, no, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, in their own consolidated state plan to federal government. So just a little teaser to note that as we go through the presentation, keep in mind that virtually every statistic we show you is from the Commonwealth itself. And in reality, very little about the system here is in dispute, except the tricky question of whether we should solve these problems. So first, the sources of school funding, just basic refresher. Across the US, public education is funded through a partnership between federal, state, and local governments. Federal funds have always played a small role in education finance, and a large majority of funding for K-12 public education has always come from state and local governments. For Pennsylvania's 500 school districts in 2018-19, there's approximately 3% of total revenue from the federal government, 38% from state appropriations, and 57.6% from local governments. Significantly, the local share of educational revenue and expenditures has decreased in many states over time, but the local share of total education funding has increased in Pennsylvania since the 1970s. And as a result, Pennsylvania school districts are more reliant on local taxes to generate funding than school districts in almost any other state. In 2015-16, for example, only 6 states were more reliant on local education funding than Pennsylvania. And right now, Pennsylvania is ranked 47 out of 50 states in terms of its state share of public school funding. You might ask, if the schools are underfunded, why are my property taxes so high? That is, of course, because the state of Pennsylvania is not paying its fair share, and local taxpayers have to make up that difference. The heavy reliance on local property taxes to fund public schools results in these dramatic inequities that we're going to be talking about tonight. The revenue gap between the richest and the poorest has in fact grown by $1,000 per student since 2008 and 09. And this has grown even though property taxes for the poorest districts have increased more than the richest district rates. As an example, New Hope Salisbury School District has a tax rate of 12.6 mils. Local revenue they're raising is $25,000. State revenue they receive is $4,640, and the state-local combination per child there is $30,000. Reading School District, in comparison, a tax rate of 25.9 mils. Local revenue they're able to raise is $2,500. The state revenue they receive is higher, but the state local per child is still only $13,256 for the difference per child of $16,888. So this local effort, you can see, also comes into play when you consider what student populations we have in these different districts. You know, which district actually needs more to serve the students that they actually have in front of them. And we believe that school funding should flow to the students and districts based on what they actually need to serve the students they have. It costs more in programming, resources, teacher time to serve the needs of English learners and students living in poverty. And the state, of course, recognized this in the creation of the fair funding formula that Dan will go into in some detail. For many of you, this is your everyday. But what does underfunding actually look like in schools? You know, in wealthy school districts, we see lower class sizes compared to underfunded schools that have, you know, max class sizes of 30 and insufficient space to actually fit all of their students, instead using hallways or storage rooms. Wealthy school districts have reading specialists, the math coaches, and underfunded, no remedial support available. Counselor support at all levels, those tier 1 interventions across the board, a social worker, a parent liaison, the community support, compared to too few counselors, dramatically over recommended ratio, who are only available to kind of triage the crisis needs. Variety of advanced classes available versus no or few AP courses. You know, high quality teachers with experience that receive, you know, higher salaries across the Commonwealth compared to underfunded schools that have to compete for the same teachers and have less salaries perhaps to offer, and often have some more turnover or teachers teaching outside of certification. wealthy districts have administrator specialists instead of the single administrator wearing 5 hats. State-of-the-art science labs instead of torn, outdated books you can't bring home. You know, building facilities issues abound for districts that can't afford the maintenance. And, you know, we see that in outcomes in wealthier school districts, higher test scores and graduation rates, college and career readiness, compared to the lower test scores and slower progress for English learners in underfunded schools. And I think, you know, I just also add that, of course, the differences among schools in 2020 is obviously even more drastic given the COVID pandemic. You know, the pandemic has laid bare the inequities that have long existed in our system and which are, of course, the subject of our case. So again, to state the obvious, you know, it takes resources to respond to a pandemic. So those schools that were well funded before have been better able to pivot quickly in some cases to serve students at this most difficult time. You know, if you had previously the resources to have all students with a laptop before the pandemic, you were perhaps better able to ensure quick turnaround when schools had to close last spring. You know, if the districts that had the resources to upgrade their buildings and didn't have space issues had a better chance of keeping students in school safely. In policy here, the underfunding looks like these issues that our lawsuit seeks to attack. The low relative state contribution that I mentioned, the funding that is not sent through the formula in greater proportion, and Dan will go through some of these issues in more detail. No state goal of actually fully funding schools to the needs presented in each district. These unfair, disproportionate property tax burdens, and the unacceptable outcomes for children that I mentioned. So this is what our lawsuit seeks to challenge, those policies in that system. The petitioners in our lawsuit are 4 families and 6 school districts across Pennsylvania and 2 statewide organizations, the NAACP and the Pennsylvania Association of Rural and Small Schools. We also highlight the particular funding needs of the School District of Philadelphia through a parent petitioner. And our respondents are those state actors that are responsible for the school funding system. So the leaders of the Pennsylvania Senate and the House of Representatives, the governor, the State Department of Education, and the State Board of Education, and the secretary. Some kind of profile of our case and the claims. This was filed in 2014. Our team has been at this for quite a while. Were filed in the Pennsylvania Commonwealth Court, and we have 1 count based on the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that the General Assembly shall provide for the maintenance and support of a thorough and efficient system of public education to serve the needs of the Commonwealth. And then a 2nd count on equal protection that seeks to address those disparities between school districts across the Commonwealth. So our Constitution says that the General Assembly is responsible. The reality facing our students in schools is that they don't have the resources they need to meet state standards and to participate meaningfully in the economy and our democracy. We think the funding system is inadequate because the state doesn't provide school districts with the resources they need, and that it's inequitable because the way funding is distributed by the state creates these outrageous disparities. The remedy that we're seeking with the lawsuit is we're asking the court to declare the current broken system of school funding unconstitutional and to direct the legislature to create a constitutional funding system. The legislature needs to increase the amount of money provided by the state to schools, and they need to ensure that the additional funds are driven to districts serving students who have the most significant needs. So what do we need to prove? Under the adequacy element, we have to address what is the constitutional standard and has it been met? How will you know? Does it require more money to meet it? Or is it, as the respondents would argue, the students or somebody else's fault? And under the equal protection clause, is there some reason, is there some excuse for the disparities that doesn't require them to be addressed or remediated? So the respondents say that Pennsylvania is already a high spender comparatively across the national average, and students score comparatively higher on one of the national assessments, the NEEP. They say that the new formula will solve all the problems, that this has already been addressed, and there's no further change needed. They say that failing students have the same access to programs as successful students, and that it is, I think, the logical extension that it's some fault of the students for not taking advantage of those programs, or some failing of the students or the other players in the system, and that the funding doesn't actually explain the outcomes in Pennsylvania, that there are other factors, and indeed we've heard that it's family structure or violent or poor communities, that it's really not anything but the funding. So where are we now in the lawsuit? We have come a long way from 2014. This past year, we've exchanged extensive discovery, over 100,000 pages of documents. We've taken over 70 depositions of all different players. We submitted 13 expert reports, or the parties exchanged 13 expert reports and 11 rebuttal reports. We currently have pending for us to reply a summary judgment motion that really was pretty minor and did not actually attempt to have the case dismissed. And so we really expect that this trial should go forward in 2021. We don't yet have a formal date for that, but we'll be sharing that with some excitement as soon as we do. I'm going to turn to Dan for some more detail on some of the elements that I just provided an overview.
Thanks, Christina. Hi, everybody. Again, thanks so much for paying attention to this topic on a late weekday night. I just want to start by emphasizing something that Christina said, which is, and I'm going to get into the fair funding formula, but one of the things that she said was, there is no goal of fully funding public schools in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And I think that we all need to it's important to recognize what a fundamental failure that is. Right? What that means is that the legislature does not start the year by saying, what do our schools need and how do we get there? Right? That conversation does not happen. And so as a result, what happens is school districts are really left to their own devices, or they're left to fend for themselves. So what do our schools need this year? That is a conversation that happens in wealthy school districts, right? Superintendent goes to the board and says, these are the resources I want for this year, whether that's a COVID year or a more normal year. The school district, the school board figures out how to come up with the funds and they go forward. But in lower wealth school districts, those conversations don't happen. The conversations in lower wealth school districts are, what can we afford to do this year, right? And that is a fundamental, the reason that low wealth school districts have to have that conversation is because the legislature, who's ultimately responsible, doesn't even attempt to adequately fund public schools. And that is, if you can take away one lesson from tonight, I think it is that one. You hear a lot about the fair funding formula. And Christina mentioned that one of the arguments to try to get rid of this suit has been, we've got this new funding formula that will solve all of the problems. And so I just want to focus for a minute on that funding formula and go through it. So the first is that this was enacted in 2016. There was a state commission that had said, we should fund school districts based on their actual needs, based on some of the factors that Christina mentioned, the number of kids that are learning English, for example, or the number of kids in poverty, because as a general matter, these are groups of kids that need more resources to achieve the same as their peers. And the formula does that, and does that in a great way, in a very reasonable way. But there's a fundamental failure with the formula, which is basically where I started, which is that the formula does not actually ask how much funding is needed. In other words, it doesn't say what is the total amount of funds, or what are the total teachers, or what are anything that school districts actually need to provide their kids, and then how do we get there? All the formula does is it says, if the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania distributes $100, how do we divvy up that $100? And so if your share of the pie is not big enough for the needs of your district, then it's just on you to figure out how to come up with the rest. High-well school districts do that. Low-well school districts do not. And that's the first problem. The second problem with the formula is that it doesn't actually even apply to all of the funding that the state distributes. So the state distributed, prior to the formula being enacted, somewhere in the range of $5.5 billion in basic education funding. It was distributed in a sort of a mess of a system. That $5.5 billion is still distributed through that same mess of a distribution system. It goes out the same every single year. So when they enacted this new funding formula, the only thing it applied to was quote unquote new money, the money that was distributed after 2014-15. And so as a result, even though we have a new funding formula, only 11% of our basic education funding goes through the formula. You might have heard about hold harmless, and I'm going to show you some illustrations of that. But when people are talking about hold harmless, what they're really talking about is the fact that only small bits of our funding actually goes through the formula, and the rest is locked in year after year after year. The districts are held harmless from changes from year to year. I'll just skip through that. And so here's how that looks in practice. So if we started each year with using the formula and applying it to all funding, we would shift about $1.2 billion from district to district to district, because again, we have this pie. It's now about $6 billion, and it's probably still not big enough to begin with. But if we said, okay, we're going to use this funding formula that we decided is a good formula, and we're going to distribute it according to what the formula says, districts would get wildly different amounts of money than they actually do now. So, just an example, you heard about the Reading School District. If the formula were used for all of the money, the Reading School District next year would get $97 million additional dollars, right? Or $5,000 per child. The Greater Johnstown School District would get over or close to $3,000 per child, right? That we're talking about pretty transformative amounts of funding. The trouble with that, though, is that because it's only we're not actually saying the pie should be big enough. We're just saying we should divide the pie. If Johnstown gets $3,000, another district's going to lose $3,000, right? If Reading is getting $5,000, another district's going to lose $5,000, right? The state has created a zero-sum game, and because they've created a zero-sum game, it leaves these school districts to fight over their little share of the pie, as opposed to saying, well, we should have a system where everybody gets enough. The other thing is, as Christina mentioned, Pennsylvania has massive race and class disparities, right? So our school districts are among the most segregated by race and class anywhere in the nation. Our school districts have along the school district borders have some of the biggest disparities. And frankly, the quickest way to find an underfunded district in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is just to look for the presence of children of color. That's not to say there aren't districts that are underfunded that are mostly white kids. There absolutely are. But if you want a quick shortcut to find an underfunded district, look for the presence of children of color. And why does this all matter, right? Well, there's basic fairness here, right? But we don't want money for money's sake, right? Money means those strategies that Christina talked about: books, teachers, counselors, technology, right? But it also means better outcomes for the kids in these districts, right? Some of you have lived this, but the reason why this matters is because it matters to the success of the students that are going to leave in 12th grade, right? And proficiency scores are not the be all and end all. There's a lot of ways you can measure how districts do, but there's certainly one measure. And what they show are huge gaps, just like there are huge funding gaps between the wealthy and the poor. There are also huge outcome gaps between the wealthy and the poor, right? So 8th grade math, 67% of students are scoring below proficient, and they're particularly 39% are scoring below basic, but those numbers are far worse if you are a low-income student, right? Huge gaps between students that are low income and students that are not low income in almost every district in the Commonwealth, but it is particularly exacerbated in districts where a school district can't actually give kids the resources that they need. And why does this matter? Again, you see it in college attendance rates. So I'll give you one more statistic, that in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, a low-income child is not only more likely to go to college if they're in a high-funded district as opposed to a low-funded district, that low-income child is more likely to graduate from college if they were in a well-funded school district. When we go to trial, we just want to show that all students can learn. The research is clear, and we want our students to be given the opportunity. I want to touch on a couple more points. The first is, a lot of people ask us, well, how much do school districts actually need, right? What is the amount of money that we're talking about here? There is no perfect, there's never going to be a perfect amount. There's not going to be a perfect amount. But I want to tell you a story, which is that in 2008, 2009, and 2010, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania actually calculated how big the pie should be. For 3 years, they calculated how big the pie should be. In 2007, the Commonwealth had done something called a costing out study, where they had tried to actually put a number on it, how big the pie should be. And then in response to that costing out study, the state said, okay, here are the adequacy targets. For each district, here's how big the pie should be. But we can't fund it all in 1 year. We were at that point billions of dollars behind. So we're going to try to get there in 6 years. In 2011, the state amended the law that had these adequacy targets in them. And what they said is, it's no longer the state goal to meet these adequacy targets in 6 years. What they didn't do is they didn't actually stop the calculation. They didn't take out of the law that the Commonwealth every year is supposed to actually calculate adequacy targets. They just really deleted from the law that they would actually try to meet those goals. But they haven't calculated these adequacy targets. They haven't calculated how big the pie should be since 2010. And so as a part of this lawsuit, one of the things we did is we did the calculation for them. And what that showed is that today, or as of 1819, when we have the most recent statistics, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is underfunding public schools, state and local resources combined, by $4.6 billion. $4.6 billion. More than half of all school districts are more than $2,000 behind per child. If you want to go to Fund Our Schools, if you go to FundOurSchoolsPA.org, you can look up any school district in the state and see how far your district, your neighboring district, is behind according to, again, the Commonwealth's own numbers. And we have a couple of superintendents from some of our the petitioner school districts, but here's what that means. In Lancaster, according to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the school district is underfunded by $4,500. In Johnstown, it's $4,200. Panther Valley, $6,000. Shenandoah Valley, $7,000. Wilkes-Barre, $3,800. And William Penn, $4,800. What we're talking about, that is per child every year. That doesn't count capital expenses like buildings. It doesn't count special education, just your basic classroom costs. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania's own numbers show that our plaintiffs, our petitioner school districts, but also school districts all over the state are profoundly underfunded. The other thing to note is that it's actually, those numbers are probably a conservative estimate. They're based on a time when our standards were less rigorous than they are today. Since that formula was passed, since those adequacy targets were developed, school districts have had to deal with explosion in pension costs and have had to spend more and more and more and more and more and more money on pensions. So that $4.6 billion is actually probably a low number. But there are a lot of ways that you can measure underfunding. But any reasonable way, I think, that you do so, you will find that the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is really dramatically underfunding its schools generally, and in the petitioners in this case specifically. Right, those 6 school districts, the School District of Philadelphia, school districts that are members of the Pennsylvania Association of Rural and Small Schools, which is another plaintiff in this case, in district after district after district, you will find school superintendents that can't provide their students what they know they deserve, right? The resources every child needs, the resources that we'd all want for our own kids. And so because we have a lot of people from Johnstown on, I just wanted to give a brief overview. You obviously are living this, so you know it, but just a quick, where does Johnstown rank in all this? So one way the state measures poverty, the relative wealth of a school district, is by something called the aid ratio. It's where they look at the incomes in a district and the property values in a district. They rank every school district in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So out of 499 districts, Greater Johnstown School District ranks 480th. Right? It's a place that is, if you were there, right? And one of the joys of being one of the lawyers representing these school districts in the last 5 years has been that I've gotten to travel around the Commonwealth and spend time in every one of these communities. It's no surprise that Johnstown is a struggling place, right? Property values are decreasing, not increasing. And the state sees that in its numbers. In the school district itself, 86% of children are classified as economically disadvantaged. Right? And those adequacy targets mean that each year, according to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Johnstown needs almost $13 million every single year. What do we hope to accomplish with this lawsuit? So there actually have been a lot of these lawsuits around the country in the last 30 years or so. And so people have started to study the impact of these lawsuits. And what the studies show is that these lawsuits, when they're successful, when petitioners like ours win, they tend to work. They're successful. The money goes to the districts, because what you'll hear from members of the legislature is something to the effect of, yeah, you might win, but or let's say, what you might hear from a skeptic about this lawsuit is, you might win, but how are you going to get money from the legislature to do anything? What generally happens with these lawsuits is that, in fact, after petitioners win, there is more money that goes into districts, particularly the districts that need it. And as we would expect, those school districts, the students in those school districts see increases in academic achievement and lifetime success, because money matters, right? You're going to do better when you have smaller classes. You're going to do better when you have counselors. You're going to do better when the building's not falling around you. And we also hope that this lawsuit, if successful, will break the impasse that has sort of overtaken Harrisburg year after year after year, leaving school districts to fend for themselves. So, as Christina said, we are going to trial sometime in 2021, right? We will go to trial. We are going to put the system on trial, right? We are going to put these school districts are going, superintendents and teachers and community members are going to testify about what things look like. And so we hope that you will follow along. If you care about these issues, please go to FundOurSchoolsPA.org, sign up. We will keep you up to date. There's also a really important organization called PA Schools Work, which sort of does political lobbying for more school funding. You can sign up with them as well and keep yourself involved, because the only way that any of this is going to change is not just a court case, right? We're suing the state because we believe that these districts are underfunded. The only way this is actually going to work long-term is if citizens all over the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania demand the legislature actually finally fix this problem. So that is it. This is our contact number, our contact information. If you have any questions, you know, if I know, I'm sure Christina would say the same. I am happy. I mean, now it's via Zoom. If you are in a community where you want someone to come and talk about inadequate school funding in your community, what it means to your community, and we're happy to do that. And so please reach out to us and contact us. And we're gonna open up to questions, I think, but I wanna give a couple of questions to two people first, because we have with us in the presentation, 1 second, let me stop this. We have with us Damaris Rao. Dr. Rao is the superintendent of the School District of Lancaster. And we have with us Amy Arcurio, who is the superintendent of the Greater Johnstown School District. And so I wanted to start with Dr. Rao. And if you would, for just, you can be as short as you want, but talk about why your district is participating in this lawsuit and what it would mean to your district to have the funding that you believe you need.
Thank you, Dan. You know, when I talk to people, I think the best way for people to understand is to get a real concrete example of how this inadequate funding impacts our students. So when we all closed on March 13th because of the COVID crisis, many of my suburban peers were able to get up and running in terms of providing for remote learning immediately, because many of them were one-on-one school districts. So we were not. So we were, of the 16 school districts in Lancaster County, we were the last school district that was able to provide the educational continuity plans because we didn't have enough technology. And so we were struggling to find that. And even at the end of finding technology and getting donations and using our fund balance, even then we were only able to provide our secondary students with one device per child. At the elementary level, we were only able to provide one per family. So if you can imagine, if you're in a household with 2 or 3 children who have to share one device because your school district is so underfunded that they can't provide that for kids, that was heartbreaking. And of course, we know that with so many of us now doing remote learning, how this is so difficult. And the other example I like to give, because adults oftentimes don't understand it, but so our children get a bus to school, our high schoolers, if you live 2 miles away. How many of us walk for 2 miles to get to our place of employment? And yet we expect our kids to do that in all kinds of weather because we can't afford additional buses to get our kids to school. And so of course that then impacts their attendance, because if it's cold and rainy or snowy, many of them choose, I'm not going to walk 2 miles to school that day. And of course, your attendance impacts your achievement. So it's just one vicious cycle of how inadequate funding really impacts really the day-to-day life of our students in Lancaster.
Thank you, Dr. Rao. That's really well said. What about, do we have, yes, there I see Superintendent Amy Arcurio of the Greater Johnstown School District. How do you see underfunding impacting your district?
It's amazing how the comments made by Dr. Rao are exactly our same comments in Greater Johnstown when we talk about the inability to provide technology to our students. And we too were not able to get up and running on March 13th like a lot of our neighboring districts were. But one of the things that I think that we face and we recognize each and every day in our district is how amazing our teachers are and our administrators, and how they are able to do so much with so little to make an impact on the lives of their students. And I can't help but think, what would they be able to do if they were given the appropriate resources each and every day to meet the needs that our children come to school with? They're amazing individuals and they work so hard, and you don't enter a job because you don't have the resources to perform your job. You enter a profession and you enter a job because you should be given all of the tools to have in your toolbox to be the most effective that you can possibly be. And so our teachers are constantly struggling to have more tools in their toolbox. They often use their own money, their own dollars from their own paycheck to make ends meet and to provide the students with the resources that they need. And that's amazing to me that we are able to do so much with so little. Can't even imagine where our future would be and the resources, if we had the adequate resources, the opportunities that our students would have and be able to take advantage of. And so being a part of this fair funding lawsuit is extremely important for all of our children across the Commonwealth, and especially our children, our brown and black children who often don't have a voice. And we need to be the voices for those students, and we need to be the advocates for our teachers in a wonderful profession, because that's really what this is all about. This is getting children to the potential they have in front of them. And we all have examples of kids who came from nothing and became something. And every child in the Greater Johnstown School District, the School District of Lancaster, they deserve the opportunities so that they can take where they have nothing and become something. It's the definite lift out of poverty that our children deserve.
That's really well said. And you know, as someone, so I have had the privilege of spending a lot of time in all these communities, and it is striking, you know, from the city of Philadelphia, which has 200,000 students, to Shenandoah Valley, which has, I think, around 1,100 students total, in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania. Just the commonalities you hear. It's, you know, this is no secret. Like there's no, it's not like we are trying to, you know, solve nuclear fusion here, right? We need to get school districts enough teachers, enough counselors, enough books. It's the base reading specialists so that they can help their kids. And you just really see it from district to district to district. Dan,
our mill rate in the city of Lancaster is double compared to any other school district in the county. So you're asking the poorest of folks to pay the highest amount of taxes. Yeah. Yep. And you see that again, it's across the Commonwealth. The lowest wealth, you know, there's this, we all hear, I think, in popular culture that, you know, that kids go to suburban, well-funded suburban schools because that's, you know, that's sort of what their parents wanted, right? You move to the suburbs for good schools. But in fact, if you look at tax rates, you just look at it as the measure of how hard communities are trying. The lowest wealth communities, the people that have the least resources, consistently across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania are trying harder than their wealthy neighbors. Right. So in other words, low wealth school districts aren't underfunded because they're not trying. Low wealth school districts are underfunded because they're low wealth. Let's just, we have some questions in the chat. I can read through these.
There's a couple of questions to the effect of, you know, what can we do? Where do we raise these issues if we're concerned? And I first thank you so much for the question and for the interest. You know, I think absolutely call your legislators and make clear to them that you care about this issue. You care about the adequacy, that schools get enough money based on the student needs that they have, and that it be equitably distributed. So I think calling legislators directly is great, and absolutely should happen. I think we also do face, you know, a public education kind of need, and I think it's those of you living in these districts with these needs, you know it and you're living it, so it may seem super obvious to you, but those that aren't living it, it's not obvious. And I think that's one of the opportunities that we have in the lawsuit and in this related policy advocacy to make really clear to others with these examples from the folks that described, you know, that we'll bring to trial and that also shared in deposition so far in the case, what it actually looks like and what it feels like to students and to teachers to be coming into underfunded schools every day and to not have the resources they need to teach the students that they, you know, have committed to teaching, and or students to want to succeed, to be so motivated to learn, to walk those 2 miles and to persevere, but not have the resources, not be able to have the books or to have the technology or to, you know, be wearing a coat all day in class because the heating system doesn't work the way that it should. Those are obvious to those of you living it, but it's examples that we really need to see in letters to the editor or, you know, in presentations to folks cross districts to make sure that this is, you know, shared experience and shared knowledge for all folks across the Commonwealth, so that it's seen as, you know, a collective problem and not just the problem of the underfunded districts. We need everybody to be, you know, kind of activated and concerned and raising voices about this.
Yeah, and I see that there's a lot of younger faces on this, presumably due to the work of one Jerry Zahorchik. But, you know, I would just say that for those of you who are fortunate enough to go to a well-funded school, you know, you also have to be ambassadors, because, you know, one of the reasons this system goes on for so long is because we have these walls, we have these school district borders. And so some people are doing okay, right? We have allowed these sort of, you know, these metaphorical walls to be built around various communities. And those communities, like they wanted a good education for their kids, but so does everybody else. And so if you had the good fortune to grow up in a school district that was well funded, that had the basic resources that you were supposed to have, it's important that in your own community you be a strong advocate, because the ultimate solution here does come from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It really does. And someone asked, you know, can this happen can the governor by himself solve this problem? The answer is absolutely not. No, I mean, you have to have the governor. I think it's fair to say is a pretty strong supporter of increasing funding for public schools. But the reality is that since he has been governor, he hasn't been able to significantly increase funding for public schools. That if you look at basically since the governor was elected originally, and this is not a partisan talk, but it is a simple fact that the single biggest issue which got Tom Wolf elected and which got Tom Corbett unelected was the big education cuts that happened when Tom Corbett came into office. The sad reality, though, is that even though that was the biggest issue, and even though Tom Wolf had a very ambitious agenda when he came in, is that when you take into account inflation, school district funding has basically been flat for his 6 years as governor. So even though that was the single biggest issue in that election, we're still really living in the era of those budget cuts. So we have to and that's not because he doesn't want to change it, but frankly, the legislature has just said no. So again, we have to get the legislature to pay attention. We're going to do that through the lawsuit. But the lawsuit is just one sort of tool to do that. We also need an outraged public to demand they finally fix it.
Hey, you invoked Jerry Z's name, so if I may, you know, I'm so pleased that the two superintendents spoke tonight because, as you said, they lived that, and they really are great leaders, both of them, and I appreciate their eloquence tonight. I also am so pleased that the rural and small schools are signed on. And that's 100+ school districts that have said yes to this important thing. And so I think a lot of the legislators would be influenced as we rise up in terms of the people like the two superintendents and many other superintendents who can speak up. I want to tell you just a quick story. When I used to testify on these very issues in front of the House and Senate's Appropriations Committee every year. And I'll never forget a woman left Reading School District as the chief. She grew up there. She was an administrator and then was the chief for a long time. And then was hired out to, and Reading is very, very struggling school. You use them as the most in terms of examples. Melissa Jamula was the superintendent there, and she knew it very well because she grew up there and she was around that school forever. She went over to the Upper Marion School District. Now think about that. That's a huge contrast. And after a testimony one time, she came and put both her hands on my shoulders and said, no matter what they say, we don't need any money from the state. The school district of Reading and those like Reading need the funds. Now there's a woman who lived it. I don't know if she's telling her story today. And by the way, she whispered it to me, so don't tell anyone I told you.
One of the things that we're going to put on at trial, Superintendent Arcurio, Superintendent Rao, they're going to be some of the star witnesses in this case, right? Along with teachers and counselors and families. But some of the other people that are going to testify are like a superintendent, for example, from Springfield, Montgomery County, where their experience or her experience in Springfield is the exact opposite from what these two superintendents have to deal with, just in terms of what budget reality she faces each year. She needs more reading specialists, so she needs more social workers. She asks the board gives them to her. That's what her budget is like. Her budget process is like each year, for a population that has much smaller needs than the petitioners here. And I do think that's powerful testimony, again, from people who have been on the other side of the divide, that know that how things should be. Do we have other questions?
While we pause, let me just plug again what's been put in the chat box, which is a website that shares information about the funding case and that we'll be updating as we do go to trial. It's FundOurSchoolsPA.org, and there's a option to input your email address and get involved. And that's how we can continue to share information from you and share opportunities for you to write a letter to the editor. You can get support from our communications team if you've never done that before, but it's a great opportunity for students or community members, parents, to share your experience.
Sam asks, on the topic of legislators, have you identified any strong allies? The answer is yes. There are state legislators who actually have volunteered to testify in this case to talk about how broken the system is. But right now, even those strong allies can't fix it. Right now, there is, I think it's fair to say, Harrisburg is stuck. Even prior to the COVID budget crisis, the inability, for example, to even talk about raising statewide taxes so that there can be a broader base tax, so it's not left up to every school district to fend for themselves. It's just a reality that the party in control in Harrisburg is uninterested and has stopped that from happening. So the answer is yes, we do have some very strong allies, but those allies have unfortunately not been able to fix this, which is one of the reasons why we have sued. Let's see. Holly asked us talking to our state legislative representative help. The answer is absolutely. Alan asks, can we show this video to our community? The answer is yes, although Alan, I believe you're a member of the Johnstown NAACP, and I would be happy. The NAACP is also a plaintiff in this case, and so you're welcome to show them this, but I'd also be happy to, and I'm sure Christina would as well, to talk to either just in Johnstown or statewide, talk to the NAACP and do one of these presentations for them as well. All right. I think that is it. And we are.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So I
How can
think
people get
we have
involved
all
with-
the questions.
I'm sorry. I was saying, how can people get involved with Ed Voters?
Well, so education voters, so I have all of your emails, and so I will send out to you when we have the recording ready, the recording, so that you have a link to it so you can watch it and share it. That might take us a few days. We're also going to be having an interpretation done in Spanish. That will take longer than just a few days, but we are going to have that, and those will be posted on the Ed Voters website so that people can kind of watch this at their leisure. Also, we work really closely with the law centers, and I know that they are really looking for families that are going to be able to tell the stories of what it is like to be in these underfunded school districts. So, you know, they will also have your contact information. I will give you their contact information in an email. If you're willing to talk to Jonathan McJunkin or Paul Sokolow, who are the communications people, they will work with you to be able to tell the stories in an op-ed or a letter to the editor. There is nothing that gets the attention of a state lawmaker more than having an op-ed or a letter to the editor in the newspaper that tells a story that says something that does not comport with what they're necessarily telling their community about their support for something like public education. It is a really, really powerful tool to be able to get stories in the newspaper. They get in the paper newspaper that goes out to like older people in communities who actually still get paper newspapers, but then they also get put online, and so then they can be shared on social media. And all of that works together to build the pressure that we're going to need to build, and to build the movement that we're going to need to build over the next year or two to get these lawmakers to do what they need to do. And in addition, I think we're looking toward 2022, and this has to be an election issue. Like, we're all nonpartisan. It's not about electing Republicans or Democrats. It is about electing lawmakers who are actually going to support the funding that we need. And there are plenty of Republicans who support it, and there are Democrats who support it. But they need to know that this is something that their constituents care about. And I saw the comments in the chat. There are a lot of families who are overwhelmed with their lives when you're working 2 or 3 jobs, and now you're remote schooling your children, and you don't have good internet, and you don't have the right devices. It's really difficult. So I think for any of us who have extra bandwidth, if we can be the ones who start speaking up about this in communities, rich and poor, urban and rural, all over the state, that's what we need to do. So that's what we're going to work on. And you'll get an email from me tomorrow. I'm not sure that the link to the recording might take a little bit longer, but we'll be in touch. And just so grateful that everyone came out tonight on a late night to do this, and really, really grateful for Dan and Christina for sharing their time. They both have really young children at home, and so this is an hour away from their families in the evening. And so really grateful, and also really grateful to Dr. Rao and Mrs. Arcurio for coming on, and everybody who came out. So I think that we are going to say thank you, and if there are any questions in the chat that we didn't get to, we'll get those answered also.